Hello, everyone. My name is Páraic Finnerty, and I'm the president of the Emily Dickinson International Society. And I want to welcome everyone to day two of our three-day annual meeting for 2026. The sessions from yesterday will shortly appear on our YouTube channel, and thanks to Don Skoog, who's going to help us put those YouTube videos up there. I want to thank all the presenters, the chairs, and also the participants for yesterday's session. It was absolutely brilliant. And I also want to thank my co-organizer, Yuhan Thien, who was amazing. I want to thank Dan Manheim and the annual meeting organizing committee for all their work for these 3 days of wonderful papers and presentations and performances. Dan came up with this theme of connectedness. And I would like to dedicate the annual meeting to this spirit of connectedness. During today's event, we will collectively explore how we connect with Dickinson, how reading poetry enables us to connect with others, and how Dickinson thinks about human connection. So I'm going to hand over now to Dan.
Thank you excuse me. Thank you very much, Páraic. Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for coming too, especially people from the US, from the Eastern US. Martha Nell got in there before I did, who got up at 4:45 and blinked a little bit, but they were all readier than I was. And I also want to thank all the presenters. I loved yesterday's sessions. It was one thing after another, and I was still digesting one paper, and other new stuff was coming along for me to think about. I wanted to say a little bit more than Páraic did about the topic this year. It kind of came to me on the spur of the moment when we were in Taiwan last year, and I proposed Dickinson and connection, not because of, it was a hybrid conference and some people were one way and some people were the other, but it did seem a good thing at this time. I just wanted to point out a few things about the program. There will be in part because there are people coming from all around the world. I've been very happy to see some former delegates from India and some new delegates. So there are conversation sessions that I'm going to be present at, and anybody else is welcome at, tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern US time, and tomorrow evening at the end of it all. And the primary purpose of those was for those who had a chance to watch the videos, but wanted to talk about sessions that they couldn't attend. But anybody can come. And I urge members to join if you're available and interested. And if nobody shows up, that's okay too. Thank you for coming online. I too prefer Amherst. I love getting together with people there, and I love the town and the museum. And I too, as many of you do, I think, probably have PTSD about teaching online classes and about all of the hazards and things that can go wrong, all of the blank faces, and you wonder if anybody's there, which is not to say everybody has to show their face. But I also am very happy to be here online, seeing some people who haven't been here for a long time, who aren't there. The Republic of Georgia was represented yesterday, and I hope Misha will be back. Czechia is there, and I hope Carolina may be here. India, is Morocco out there? I don't know. But I was able to reach out to a number of people who haven't been here before from around the world, and I'm very glad that they're able to come. Yesterday again was, and here comes Georgia now. Yesterday, as Páraic said, and I've already said, was just full of brilliant sessions. If you weren't there, there were papers, among other things, on house cleaning, monsters, ecophenomenology, Lebanese plant collection, typology, rhizomatic connections beneath the fascicles, poetry as resistance to fascism, a newly discovered piece of prose, and a rain of purple. Further proof that whatever thoughts we want to explore, Emily Dickinson can help us to sustain. Hence, Emily Dickinson and connection. We are online this summer for a number of practical reasons, but also because it struck us that connection, international connection especially, is the life's blood of an organization that calls itself an international society. And it's not as easy as it could be right now. A country fighting a war of aggression, of doubtful legality, where people are being arrested and placed in internment camps, where legislators threaten the citizenship of people who have never known another country or national identity. This is not a country that sets great value on human connection. International travelers understandably think twice about visiting a country that is determined to show itself, in the mildest terms possible, as inhospitable. In this climate, simple acts of the most basic civility gain much greater significance. During the recent World Cup competition, there was a story in the Times quoting Paula Mendoza, an organizer for an advocacy group that campaigned against the presence of immigration agents at the event. She said her group had worried that the World Cup would be marred by fear and violence. There was a touch of that. But instead, what struck her, she said, was moments of kindness, community relief, safety and joy and connection, and that's what this world desperately needs. I hope that through the technology of Zoom, we can reproduce something like that experience here over these 3 days. Because whatever Emily Dickinson was doing with her work, and there are an infinite number of ways of answering that question, she was all about connection. My students, I taught a senior seminar in Dickinson, just focusing on Dickinson for many years. And they used to start off saying the poems lost them. A lot of them were sullen because they didn't get into the Faulkner seminar at first. But it would all change until they saw, often after reading chapter 2 of Chris Miller's A Poet's Grammar, which I led with for years, that what seemed opaque was actually an openness, an offering of a kind of affective contract with each reader. They got that this contract was not an invitation to make a poem mean whatever they want it to mean. We can't do that any more than we can make a person mean whatever we want them to mean, though some people try. But rather an invitation to find a place where the poet's understanding meets their own, to create a space where, for a time, reader and poet can live in the same world. All literature offers this space, arguably, and that's a point worth emphasizing in a time of contraction, even direct assault on the humanities in U.S. schools at all levels. But Dickinson seems to me to have made the creation of such spaces the center of her project. Her poems are seams that include the ball, and I am going to share the poem that or am I? Here we go. Well, maybe I'm not going to share my poem. Oh, here it is. Okay. Can people see? Okay. The seams include the ball. I'm sure if anybody didn't know this poem already, they have gone and opened it. But hang on a second. But no manuscript of this poem exists outside of the fascicles, as far as I know. But it's hard to read the opening without seeing the poem as a gift. This referring to a flower, could if there have been something pinned to it, the poem itself, or maybe, as I like to think of it, the making of the poem, doing what she's doing. Without this, there is not. There is only the blankness in the margins of the page. We live in moments of connective understanding. Out of these moments, we create our memory and identity. outside of those markings that connect us in words, in memories, in reading, there's nothing but the twittering of the world, the poem tells us. How did she know what Twitter was going to be like? I don't know. We live in the conversion of that Twitter into moments of inclusion. Those are our times. Dickinson is the preeminent poet of inclusion in this sense. That inclusiveness of the whole is surely one reason why she is the US poet most widely embraced around the world. In the seams by which she makes her connections, she is a poet of global inclusiveness. So I'm pleased to welcome Elizabeth Petrino, former EDIS president, long a tireless member of the board, and currently at work with fellow board member Wendy Tronrud on the Routledge Companion to Global Dickinson.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful talk that really resonates so well with the themes of my talk. And welcome, everyone. I'm coming to you from southern coastal Connecticut. It looks as, am I sharing? Can you see the screen yet? You can't see it. Hold on just one second.
We can see you.
Now you can see it though, right?
You can.
Okay, perfect. So today what I'd like to talk about are is exactly the theme that Dan started with, which is the idea of global connection that Dickinson makes, both in terms of international influences outside of America and North America during her lifetime, as well as her global reception today. And I'd also like to draw in a couple of poets that again absorb Dickinson into themselves as a way of speaking their own concerns. Emily Dickinson was always a global figure. Moving her from a purely Anglo-American and transatlantic context to a broader global one, recent scholarship has demonstrated that less discussed geographical regions such as the Middle East, Asia, South America, and Australia were always already part of her frame of reference. Despite her decision not to travel, Dickinson displays her expansiveness in a vast array of animals, topography, objects, and people inhabiting other continents that populate her poems as she toggles between the global and hyperlocal, between deserts, the tropics, the ocean, and her own garden. A second aspect of her global reach appears in the print, social, and literary networks made possible through personal acquaintances, reading, and material culture that connected her to the world beyond Amherst. A third facet of her globalism appears in her reception internationally by contemporary writers, teachers, filmmakers, artists, and musicians, many of whom have adapted her poems into new media, as well as translators who continue to make her writing available in an ever-expanding number of languages. My talk today puts Dickinson's connection with other geographies and international writers during her lifetime and her global reception today at the center of its analysis. I plan briefly to sketch first the way networks of print and commerce connected her to international events impacting her world. And second, the way global reception puts her at the heart of today's critical political and social questions. I conclude by discussing two poets, the Kashmiri American Agha Shahid Ali and the Dominican American Julia Alvarez, who found in Dickinson's liminality inspiration for expressing their own voices and hybrid identities. Writing in 2011, Domhnall Mitchell and Maria Stewart explored the poet's international reputation, claiming that the interpretive gaps and indeterminacies which make translation difficult also led to several glaring omissions in Dickinson's global reception. Translators only privileged versions of single poems or a small cluster of poems. Little attention was paid to translating the fascicles as a whole, and translations from Spain and Italy were missing. Since then, many of these gaps have been partially addressed. While many gulfs still appear, the rare and complex task of translating her poems into Swahili, for example. Complete translations of Dickinson's poems exist in Spanish and Portuguese, based on the recent reading edition edited by Christiane Miller, as well as comprehensive translations in Italian and ongoing translation work in Albanian, Chinese, Filipino, French, Turkish, Arabic, and Icelandic, to name a few. Beyond the issue of translation, Páraic Finnerty claims that the transnational turn in American studies has revised our interpretive paradigms, making visible the way Dickinson participated in a network of writers who move between and outside of U.S. national borders. Viewing her from a global perspective, Michelle Kohler also argues that the Dickinson that emerges here does not just engage the world actively from her lookout, but is inextricably embedded in a very physical world, deeply susceptible to and permeated by it, caught up in unceasing circulations of organic and inorganic material, including printed texts, technologies, identities, and physical sensations, themselves parts of networks that circulated globally and surpassed her control. So I read Dickinson as a worldling poet who was attached to the earth and human life, through which she understood the physical and social worlds. As reading her 1844 Webster's Dictionary reveals, the term worldling denotes a person devoted to this world and its enjoyments. Webster provides an example of usage for worldling that the 18th century cleric John Rogers, that doubles as a moral lesson. If we consider the expectations of futurity, the worldling gives up the argument. Rather than being inspired to turn toward spiritual life, as Rogers hopes, however, Dickinson instead interrogated life through the body and nature. In her dictionary, world has 22 separate meanings. It refers astronomically not only to the Earth or terraqueous globe, but to the heavens, the universe, the planets and orbs, as well as to an unspecified system of beings, largely dominated by examples of Christian eschatology. World also denotes the human sphere, as in people in general, public life or society, secular life, and human customs and manners, as Webster consistently distinguishes material from spiritual life or the ungodly part of the world. Finally, he links the world to time, which transcends human life in the phrase, world without end. In her lyric beginning, "This is my letter to the world," Dickinson entrusts her poems to hands I cannot see, a phrase that may refer not only to readers whom she did not know, but to posterity. Another 19th century American poet, Walt Whitman, who refers to himself as a cosmos, also anticipates a future reader, connecting to human beings and animals by descending into the senses rather than transcending the body. Dickinson is also worlding, actively constructing, shaping, and experiencing reality in response to an understanding of international events formed through reading, correspondence, and personal relationships. In Being in Time, Martin Heidegger describes worlding as a process by which we recognize ourselves as always already entangled in a world formed by our own projected reality, set against things in the natural and created worlds and our relations with others. In the poem beginning, "Noon is the hinge of day," the place where worlds meet particularly intrigued her, as the rising and setting sun invite a liminal moment. Noon is the hinge of day, evening the tissue door, morning the east compelling the sill till all the world is ajar. Existing in a space between presence and absence creates the possibility for transforming the self as we need to recalibrate our imagined life against its reality. Similarly, in the poem that begins, "Without this there is naught," the speaker values the unstated this and rejects other worldly riches in favor of her unnamed gold. Both poems highlight entry points or connections, hinge, door, sill, and seams that define the ball or globe, images that both give shape to the self and mark our separation from the larger world. So how was Dickinson connected to a global environment in her lifetime? Through letter writing, reading, personal relationships, and material culture, she was fully aware of 19th century capitalism, commerce, and the increasing presence of American influence abroad. As Cheryl Weaver argues, Dickinson's correspondence with Abby Wood Bliss, who traveled abroad with her husband Daniel Bliss to found the Syrian Protestant College, later the American University of Beirut, was not idiosyncratic. Rather, this correspondence was the product of a network of international organizations, such as the American Board of Commissioners, as well as the efforts of personal acquaintances that facilitated the transfer of letters, material objects, and journals from the Ottoman Empire to Amherst. During her years at Amherst Academy, Dickinson studied French with her tutor, Charles Temple, who was born on the island of Malta, along with his brother. Both of their parents served there as missionaries until the family relocated to Smyrna, now modern-day Izmir, Turkey. A silhouette of the poet executed in 1845 by Temple with the inscription, "A native of Smyrna," suggests that personal acquaintances allowed a direct, unmediated route for Dickinson to what was then the Ottoman Empire and its culture. Missionaries like Abby and Daniel sought to use reading materials to convert those abroad to Christianity, but they also initiated an exchange that shared news about other cultures with their contemporaries at home. A search of her family library, for example, reveals an array of books on the Middle East, a booklet, Brief History of Turkey from 1877, as well as books on the Bedouin tribes of the Euphrates and on ancient and modern India, inscribed by the poet's father, and the history of Commodore Perry's voyage to Japan. That's Commodore Perry of gunboat diplomacy. Household items also included imported decorative plates, objets d'art, and a vast Cantonese blue and white dinner service, themselves the product of imperial trade with China after the Opium Wars. While these books and objects testify to the presence of other cultures in the family's daily lives, they also remind us that Dickinson lived when American influence was taking hold globally through neocolonialism, even as the nation expanded across the continent and focused on quelling its indigenous peoples. Reading Dickinson's poems about books through such an anti-imperialist lens opens them to new interpretations. To take one well-known example, the poem beginning, "There is no frigate like a book," implies that books can carry readers imaginatively over the sea to other lands. "There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. This travel may the poorest take, without offensive toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul." Comparing reading to the speed, maneuverability, and ability to travel vast distances afforded by a frigate or coursers allows Dickinson to explore how a reader imaginatively transcends the physical limitations of time and space. Yet, given the military overtones of a naval vessel and war horses, the poem might also resonate with themes of colonial discovery and conquest. Could this poem also refer to the intellectual warfare that was being waged through books and pamphlets to convert non-white populations in the East? In that light, the tension between the joys and risks of flight, between the desire for escape and the pleasure of not needing to travel, also may suggest Dickinson resisted the political domination involved in crossing actual geographical and national borders. In the second half of the poem, the speaker claims this travel is open to the poorest who need not face the offense or oppress of a toll. Since the end of the 18th century, turnpikes in New England were privately owned and maintained toll roads, shifting the burden away from communities to support them through taxes to private investors. In exchange, travelers would be charged a toll. Reading then becomes a liberatory act in which the reader is freed from the physical, financial, and even political constraints of time and travel. A nautical term, the variant traverse, also suggests reading provided a type of transoceanic connection, a porous boundary, passage, or bridge, as if to simulate the reader's act of moving back and forth freely over the lines between a physical and imaginative world. In spiritualizing the act of reading, Dickinson contrasts the physical limitations of actual travel with the freedom books provide as the chariot that bears the human soul carries its priceless cargo and resists the materialism and imperialism of its age. What does her global reception among international writers and readers tell us about Dickinson's ability to speak to all of us today about contemporary issues, not only capitalism and imperialism, but war, cultural alienation, immigration, language, and the environment? Reading Dickinson globally offers us insight into how the image of America in the world, rather than as the world, might be deployed through canonical figures by contemporary poets. Part of the challenge of reading from an international or transnational perspective lies in encountering scholarly perspectives that emanate largely from the global north. In Decolonizing Dickinson, Rocío Saucedo Dimas argues that students need to be encouraged first to read, enjoy, and form their views without the use of critical essays. Through employing textual analysis and contextualizing Dickinson to draw attention to race, class, and gender bias to which she was subject, Saucedo Dimas trains students to understand that, as she notes, reading implies interrogating and engaging in dialogue that is meaningful for Mexican readers. How did writers from the global South relate to Dickinson's poetry in ways that speak to their concerns? I'd like to turn to two contemporary poets who are inspired by Dickinson's ability to exist in a liminal state on the hinge of day to express their own hybrid identities. As a spiritual refugee herself, Dickinson's poems offer a welcoming space to the alien and the immigrant. These strangers in a foreign world, protection asked of me. Befriend them, lest yourself in heaven be found a refugee. Agha Shahid Ali found in Dickinson a gentle, persistent reminder of his own otherness as an exile from his native Kashmir. Born in New Delhi in 1949, shortly after the partition that granted India control of Kashmir, Shahid, whose name means both martyr and witness in Arabic, was educated in a multilingual home where Urdu, Kashmiri, and English were spoken, and which he described as culturally a very rich atmosphere without any hint of any kind of parochialism. Emigrating to the US as a student, he attended college with the intention of pursuing a literary career, teaching first at Hamilton College and later directing the MFA program at UMass Amherst. Although Shahid embraced his new culture, he refused to be defined by any one national or religious identity, calling himself a Kashmiri American poet, Indian American poet, South Asian American poet, Muslim American poet. Among his manuscripts, now in the archives at Hamilton College, he left a handwritten page of Dickinson quotations he copied out containing the word Kashmir, adding a single prophetic line of his own. Gifts left by Emily Dickinson for me. This has to be destiny. Shahid's witty comment that Dickinson could be thought to have gifted him these lines some 150 years after she wrote them makes a serious point. The image of his homeland could only resurface in his writing through the broken, refracted image she provides, which becomes a route to reclaiming his own past. For roughly a decade after he arrived in the US in 1976, Shahid did not mention the word Kashmir in his poems, even though he traveled home almost every summer after 1984. Does Shahid, who greatly admired Dickinson's poetry, reclaim the word for his birthplace after he discovers she used it? While the Hamilton College manuscript is undated, it's tempting to think so. As soon as I realized that there were 6 times Dickinson had used Kashmir in her poems, I quickly used them in my poems before anyone else could, Shahid said. And what made Dickinson's poems particularly inspiring for him as a poet? 2 poems, Ghazal and After the August Wedding in Lahore, Pakistan, might help answer that question. In Ghazal, a poem that he revised several times and later titled Tonight, Shahid brilliantly quotes from Dickinson's poems to highlight his own sense of cultural alienation. A traditional form of Persian poetry, originally drawn from the Arabic, the ghazal employs rhyming couplets that conclude with the same word as a refrain and include the name of the poet in the final stanza. His epigraph, Pale Hands I Loved Beside the Shalimar, comes from Kashmiri Song, a poem written by Lawrence Hope, a pseudonym for the Victorian poet Violet Nicholson. It's an ironic choice. By mocking the idealization of the East and its fantasy of racial purity, Shahid juxtaposes the romanticized British perception of Kashmir with his exile from his native land, as in just quoting the first 3 stanzas. Where are you now? Who lies beneath your spell tonight, before you agonize him in farewell tonight? Pale hands that once loved me beside the Shalimar, whom else from Rapture's road will you expel tonight? Those fabrics of Kashmir to make me beautiful, trinket to gem, me to adorn, how tell tonight? While the unidentified you is traditionally a lover, the identity of the addressee here is ambiguous. Could you refer to the forces that exiled Shahid and others from his homeland? Or might you refer to the citizens who still exist under the spell of an idealized image of Kashmir, despite the imposition of foreign political control? By quoting lines from Dickinson's lyric that begins, I am ashamed I hide, Shahid's speaker identifies with the bride's trepidation on her impending wedding. But while her speaker grows in confidence, Shahid's does not. Instead, he reorders the words to fit the ghazal's meter, but only to pose an unanswered question. Upasana Duda claims that Shahid's Poetics of Rupture appears in high relief when the language of Dickinson's lyrics is juxtaposed with his, when, quote, both of their voices stand in a delicate and volatile counterpoise to each other, unquote. When we consider further that Kashmiri materials in the 19th century were marketed as India shawls to female consumers in the West, one of which Dickinson herself owned, the phrase fabrics of Kashmir for Shahid is both a reminder of consumer culture and of the foreign political power occupying his homeland. In After the August Wedding in Lahore, Pakistan, Dickinson's use of Kashmir becomes a type of fleeting Eden, an emblem of Shahid's own diasporic identity. While critics have noted 2 direct references to Dickinson, other subtle allusions to her poems appear as a counterpoint to his verse. Employing 5 words that end each line in a series, pain, Kashmir, glass, night, and sing, this intricately written canzone conveys a wish to return, always frustrated, to his homeland. In the first example, after attending a wedding in Pakistan, the speaker grieves his own impending departure to the US, and then through the memory of an earlier fleeting romantic encounter in his homeland of his suffering living as an exile. Pain then becomes love's thirst, the ultimate pain to lose a stranger. Oh, to have said, glass in hand, where thou art, that is home, Kashmir or Calvary the same. If the speaker tosses off the remark, glass in hand, in feigned indifference over cocktail conversation, as if saying to his lover, wherever you are is home, the lines cut more deeply. Dickinson's poem reminds us that the exile will always suffer a sense of internal division. As Stephanie Burt claims, the soul can never be without a country, or else it is always already without a country, always in a condition of internal exile. A second Dickinson allusion appears only a few lines later. A brigadier says, The boys of Kashmir break so quickly, we make their bodies sing on the rack till no song is left to sing. Butterflies pause on their passage Kashmir, and happiness, must it bring only pain? Shahid juxtaposes the delicate flight of butterflies in south winds jostle them with the brutal torture of young men who opposed Indian security forces during the 1989 uprising. This line is followed in the original poem by another act of uprooting. I, softly plucking, present them here. The speaker's act of softly plucking the flowers collapses the time between her picking them and presenting an actual flower enclosed in the letter to Higginson. But it might also refer to plucking the strings of an instrument, a nuance perversely echoed in Shahid's musical description of the boys' bodies that sing on the rack. Could Shahid's Brigadier also invoke Dickinson's No Brigadier throughout the year, in which the Blue Jays' call is heard, a neighbor and a warrior too, like Kashmir in India? If we entertain such a possibility, then the Jays' shrill felicity contrasts distinctly with both the boys' tortured cries and the speaker's own claim that happiness perpetually escapes him. For Julia Alvarez, Dickinson's poems similarly connect across geographical and linguistic borders. The daughter of political refugees, Alvarez was born in New York City, then lived in the Dominican Republic until returning 10 years later to the US. The epilogue to her 2026 book, Visitations, is entitled Sobremesa, a word that evades translation into English, meaning the time after a meal has ended that invites conversation. In Spanish, el arte de quedarse a conversar. She recalls as a girl reciting for her sister's poems by Chaucer, Langston Hughes, Amy Lowell, Walt Whitman, and others, saving Dickinson for last. In the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze. Amen. In the following video, she elaborates on the value of learning English as a bilingual writer that connects with this theme.
I came into English when I was 10. No such thing as bilingual education. No such thing as retaining your native language. So the language that from 10 years on, I began to study a tradition in and learn to craft was English. And so it was an accident of where and when I was born and what happened to me that I came into English. That said, one of the things that was wonderful about it is that I had to learn this language when I was conscious of the language. In other words, you all learn your native language, intuitively, unconsciously. I tell all my students that when they become writers, they have to relearn even their native language as writers. And I think that going into English as a woman, a Latina, of the 50s, traditional family, where I wasn't supposed to have a public voice in Spanish. So I could obediently follow those mandates, but I was already in English creating myself. And these were new rules. And it gave me a certain protection. I could talk about things that I wouldn't have been brave enough to do so in Spanish. So it also, I think, created psychically a kind of space for myself that I wouldn't have gotten from my culture back then. And from a dictatorship, too.
In that video, then, I think part of what Alvarez says is that, as she quotes in Sobremesa, poetry provided a transnational language of musicality and emotive expression where I could speak my Spanish in English. The freedom that she provides, or that she finds in English, is also freedom that she finds in Dickinson's poetry. As the phrase, speak my Spanish in English, implies, learning English afforded her an opportunity to carve out an identity and gain a public voice by expressing ideas in a foreign tongue that would have been too radical to say in Spanish. Equally important is Alvarez's insight that the musicality of poems reaches a supralingual level that transcends its semantic meaning, perhaps especially when wrenched away from a signifying context. Much as a dinner amounts to more than food, poems generate meaning in more than words. The physical sounds, rhythms, visual form, and silences all contribute. Translators have long expressed the same view. With every new translation, we have a new version not only of the poems, but of a composite view of the poet herself, based on partial views of her oeuvre and depending on the literary canon they serve. During the period of her youth in the 1950s, when the brutal authoritarian Trujillo regime was in power, poetry flourished. As an oral medium, poetry could evade censorship and incite political change. Described as a nearly mystical experience, writing poetry for Alvarez becomes a visitation, a divine intervention in which spiritual and earthly worlds meet. Reading Dickinson's poems while she was learning English, perhaps in the very act of forming the words by taking them into one's mouth and savoring their music, inspired her and became a prayer of sorts. So to conclude, I'd like to offer two thoughts and a question to open discussion. First, it's perhaps notable that what we see as Dickinson's prescient ability to address our most critical social, political, and environmental concerns arises because she lived at a time in the 19th century when networks of capitalism, global trade, and American influence abroad first took hold, and which continue today. Second, the interpretive gaps and indeterminacies that were thought to be barriers to translation may actually invite contemporary writers to articulate their own liminal hybrid identities. Dickinson's poems inspire us to dwell in possibility, a phrase that, as it turns out, was yet another definition from her Webster's Dictionary for in the world. How do our interpretations of global poets today and of Dickinson herself change when we read them together? And how does her worlding help us in contending with the ever-increasing complexities of our time? Thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to some discussion.
Elizabeth, could you stop? There we go. Stop the share. Yes, we have plenty of time to talk about this. The next session is not until 9:30. I'm curious to know what people thought. Anybody have any initial remarks?
Fabulous.
I was thinking about you, Martha Nell, with the possibility reference, so I'm glad you saw that.
And can I make a couple of comments? I didn't raise my hand.
Yes, please.
Sure.
Okay, I mean, I'm trying to be a good student here. Um, I, of course, thought about, and I put in the chat, not to distract from what you were saying, but to complement it. But the conference we had in 2013 in College Park and Washington, D.C., and how people are still connecting through that conference and some of the old listservs and things like that that we set up at the time. That's not really my point. My point is those connections were so powerful that they spawned some reading groups, that a lot of articles came out of that conference. Anyone who wants, I gave some of them to the museum, but we have a conference book that has an abstract for every paper given at that conference and every plenary address. So if anyone wants one, I don't know if you, Dan, want some copies or whatever. They're very useful. I sometimes teach out of them. But so connectedness.
That's a great resource. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So, and enough of my going on about that. This is a question. Do you think about, I have two, this is two parts. One is, do you think about someone like Audre Lorde and her uses of the erotic, where she talks about connectedness? and how important it is, and in poetry is not a luxury. She says a very similar thing. So I wondered if you thought about that. And then the second part that may have seemed to have nothing to do with that, but I think is because it is about connections. Do you think about other media as other countries? Because,
Yes, right.
so those are my
Right.
questions.
That's a great question, two part. First, with Audre Lorde, no, I have not, but I think Dickinson is, I'm trying to uh, point out the connections to the physical sensations, the existence in the world, the worldliness as well. So Audre Lorde would be a great
I,
connection.
I can
Even,
send you those two essays.
thank you. That would be awesome. Also, someone like Walt Whitman, who I just mentioned glancingly,
Yes.
because Dickinson says, I didn't read him. I was told he was disgraceful, though it strikes me, especially after talking with Karen Carbonaire, who teaches at NYU as a clinical professor. She's writing a biography on Walt Whitman. That there were a lot of negative reviews of Leaves of Grass,
Well,
many
they
of which
himself
accused,
wrote some of them.
yes,
He was a great
which
promoter.
accused him of obviously they came from a very homophobic place.
Yeah.
And so I think when she says that, she's actually refraining. She might actually be talking about negativity, negative reviews, but certainly other media, I think, resonates very well with the Dickinson TV series, with social media, with podcasts, with all the ways that Dickinson now has proliferated, as you're suggesting, across the globe digitally. And that is yet another, I think, transformation of her into the popular mind and globally. So yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
That's great. And just, when she says Whitman is disgraceful, she's talking to Higginson. So she'd like, here, I'm going to say this to you because you'll like that.
Well, and she might becoming her own book critic.
Yeah,
One of the earlier panelists was talking about Dickinson as literary critic, which I find very fascinating.
I thought that was fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I go ahead and just call on people?
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
set
go
it up.
ahead.
Yuhun, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And then
Yeah.
it's just like the final open question that you mentioned. I just got some thought in my mind, and I think it's just so fascinating to see that Dickinson has really accompanied us through different phases of life, and personally speaking and also socially speaking, right? During the pandemic, like when the outside world keep changing, but she's still there. So when it comes to Worldling Dickinson, for her own view, I think what she kind of reminds us, or at least reminds me always, is yes, physical traveling sometimes is important, but what matters the most really is the vantage point, our mindset, right? And I think how she tries to just maintain and persisting is to stay curious, stay open-minded, but most importantly, stay humble. And I think that's what I see why some of her poetics is not talking about sympathy, but it's more about empathy. She wants to understand otherness and she welcomes other people, either in her time or even us, future readers, to understand her. And at the same time, she respects all of our understanding because we are all equal. So that's something I find maybe that's why she can be so globally well known and it attracts so many like-minded, open-minded, and humble global reader. Yeah. I don't know if
Excellent.
other
Yeah,
people agree, but that's
wonderful.
my
Yeah.
view of Dickinson. Yes.
Yes, for me, thank you for that. That's it's beautifully put. It's still an open question for me how that happens, but I agree with you. I think there is something, it's the openness to experience the empathy, the ambiguity itself of her poetry that allows her to speak to those who feel as though they are also developing their own identities, and that she is a kind of at an intersection a kind of nodal point between these networks, I think is very interesting, particularly given the time in which she lived in the 19th century. But that speaks to us today, as you're saying. So yeah, thank you for that. Adalberto?
I wish to first of all to thank for the opening words of Dan Manheim, because it includes me. I was passing through several hard crises when this administration of this president in the U.S. began. I took an enormous distance from everything related to the U.S., but Dickinson was the poet I translated for the last 10 years, so it was very difficult. And I always found comfort in Dickinson uh, during this crisis. This is why I'm coming back here to the society, because there is this strong connectedness, and the same openness, no, this ambiguity, the same openness that is inside the poem that makes Dickinson a global writer. And I just want to mention that in my art and my piece on the for the about Dickinson's imaginary geography, for the book published by Oxford, organized by Chris and Karen. Um, I was dealing with the two different issues relating Dickinson to her reception of her work. First of all, in her own poems, there is this sense of this global world, because we can find this geography. She's mentioning everywhere in the world, including Brazil. So she has 4 poems on Brazil. And as a Brazilian, I was always wondering why she's mentioning Brazil. And I discovered that she's not mentioning Brazil like only for her own joy. She's really deep into issues related to Brazil. So she's completely the opposite, because in Brazil, division that we have from Americans, that they ignore the world. So we used to see Americans from Brazil as people completely ignorant of the world, that they only live in their own reality. And Dickinson is completely the opposite of this. So I wish to thank Elizabeth Petrino for bringing these poets that share this vision that I have myself, that we read Dickinson as I mentioned in my article, as a Latina writer too. She is a Latina writer, and she is Brazilian somehow. And this, I think that this is how this connectedness is so strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
that.
Adalberto, and
Thank you for
welcome
the
back.
reference. That's great. And yeah, I would just say it's a that gives me so much to think about. And Brazil is one of those places she mentions, but she really runs through, I mean, really is completely global, as you're saying. And I focused on the Middle East here only because that seemed to me like an underrepresented area of discussion, though, of course, people have been developing more and more research in the area. And I love the fact that, for example, Peter Grima mentioned that flowers were going back, right? From, Dan mentioned Lebanon, they were being sent back by Abbie Wood Bliss, presumably, to Dickinson. And so he called them, I think, evangelistic ambassadors. It's the idea that, again, they carry import more than simply just as gifts. They act as reminders of that culture, but also, from my perspective, through the lens of American influence abroad, the desire, for example, to Christianize, right? To remind people of conversion, all of those sorts of nuances and intentions that may be subtle, but are part of that network that is, again, during her lifetime, creating that kind of global sphere of influence. So yes, great point. And I'm gonna look back. I read your piece, but I'm gonna go back to it now. Thank you for that. Vivian. I think you're on mute, Viv.
this was wonderful and eye-opening, and I learned a great deal. And I'm thinking about the ways in which your PowerPoint and moves like daring to have Julia Alvarez speaking in video. I'm thinking about the ways in which that technology, your skill with it, that media reinforces your argument, which is that Dickinson has perhaps underrated material culture dimension that earlier modes of approaching her of criticism have denied. And since Adalberto mentioned Dickinson and Brazil, I'm thinking back to the poet Elizabeth Bishop,
Yeah.
who, of course, lived in Brazil, translated Brazilian poets, was a huge advocate of Brazilian culture, had a long-term Brazilian lesbian partner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the early 50s, when she wrote about Dickinson, and specifically when she was responding to Rebecca Patterson's pioneering work on Dickinson as a lesbian, I'm thinking about the way she said, well, Dickinson is lacking in what she called common experience. And I'm thinking that this particular meeting of the society demonstrates a huge revolution, really, in ways of approaching Dickinson. And just sidebar, I'm so impressed with your willingness to think seriously about poets whose native language, I'm assuming, is not yours. And I think for many of us, that can be a stumbling block. And I just appreciate the way you've taken on these challenges.
Oh, thank you. That was just so helpful. First, to the question of media, I think you're right that there is something. I mean, we have a digital Dickinson now in terms of archive material. We have, of course, the radical scatters that Marta Werner has, brilliantly done. We have what Martha Nell has done with the Emily Dickinson archive and all of that work. But I think it would be very interesting to think about how Dickinson connects through using media into the popular culture as well, right? Like, what's the reception of the Dickinson series abroad? How are people receiving that outside of the United States, and why is it that Dickinson is able to be translated into these different media formats in the arts as well as film and media? The question also about studying poets who are non-native speakers. Actually, Ali Shaid learned English from a very early age. So, I mean, I think part of what's so interesting about him is writing the ghazal, which is, again, Persian poetry through the Arabic. He's demonstrating his ability to write masterfully in English to those English or American poets who would try to adapt the ghazal. Right? I mean, he's the one who knows how to do it the best. I think that that's important. But I think the experience of someone like Alvarez or even Ali, who are writing in English from a different cultural perspective and perhaps speaking, certainly for Alvarez, after having learned Spanish, I think that captures a really interesting question, which is how do non-native speakers appropriate Dickinson into their own writing? And what is it that makes her so, again, as Henry was saying, so open to that kind of transfer? What is it? What is the possibility there? And I think that is the question but it's also clear that she speaks to them globally because of her openness, the ambiguity, the willingness to tolerate being between states of being, being between identities in just the ways that we've been discussing. So yeah, thank you for those comments. That was great. Páraic?
So Elizabeth, I loved your paper. It was absolutely brilliant and so inspiring. So thank you so much for that. One of the things that I find fascinating here is that in some ways Dickinson may sometimes be criticized for her appropriation of otherness, her exoticism. But what you've shown us today is the way in which what we could label that is actually inspiring these writers from, let's say from these places, from Kashmir or what. So I was just wondering if you kind of reflected on that, and also, is there any level of tension? Is there a tension in these writers? Is there a sense that yes, they see Dickinson and these gaps and open to interpretation and all of the different things, but is there any level of tension that they find maybe her use of Kashmir or exoticism in any way problematic? So again, I love your paper. I think it's brilliant. I'm just wondering about, is there a tension?
Interesting.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So I think, yes, the otherness, the sense of otherness does inspire them, to the first question. And it inspires them, I think, to speak to their own sense of being between worlds, right? It impressed me that I realized that, the poem was so fitting that we're using for the conference, because it is about the seams enclose the ball. It's the idea that it gives shape to the ball, but it also defines its points of division, its junctures. And the idea of that otherness providing inspiration is key. I think it also inspires literary critics in those regions of the world. And part of what I was trying to do was call attention to the way that Dickinson studies has been populated mainly by critics from, the Western Hemisphere, not totally, but that we've only begun in that sense, I think, to really expand that, particularly encouraging more critics from internationally. As far as the tension those writers feel, I think you can see that in the way that Ali is writing, particularly the way that he invokes Kashmir, which, if you recall, in the Webster's, the dictionary definition is spelled Cashmere. There's a point at which, in Country Without a Post Office, I think he lets loose and has a whole volley of Kashmirs, all spelled differently. Because, of course, Kashmir for Dickinson became the material, right? It wasn't defined as the country. And so it's as though she gives him permission to do that. And Kashmir then takes on all sorts of other connotations in that poem, including material, woolen, even a perfume, right? So it is commodified in ways, but I think he's also responding through Dickinson to the way that that's happened, obviously outside of her control, but that he is able to, I think, reach back and be in touch with the meaning of Kashmir only through reading Dickinson, and that's what I find really fascinating. So yes, thank you. I have to think more about that, but that's great.
Excuse me 1 second, and
I know we're running late.
I see Martha Null. Anne Ramirez was asking how to raise her hand, and I see she has finally figured it out. Go ahead, Anne. You have
you're
to
on
unmute
mute.
yourself. There you go.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It was a wonderful talk. I was particularly struck by your explaining how Dickinson felt alienated and has a connection to immigrants. The poem that said, "Listen, heaven, you'll be found a refugee." And I couldn't help being reminded, just as another metaphor or phrase that relates to what I think you're talking about, Virginia Woolf's discussion of the outsiders society, that people all over the world feel like outsiders for one reason or another, and then connect to one another through a book. There is no frigate like a book that takes us lands away. And I always related very much. Virginia Woolf was my master's thesis topic back in my summer education days. And then, of course, it became part of the Dickinson community later. But I was just very impressed with this connection. And I just wanted to bring up Virginia Woolf's mention of the outsider society, that it seemed to be related to what you're talking about there.
And Anne, was it specifically through reading and through books that she found that sense of community with
exactly.
others?
And that's what is, I've been interested in.
That is a great reference. I really appreciate that. Yes, I mean, I just happened upon that poem as I was doing this, because it's fascinating to me that Dickinson uses universe occasionally, like in that Blue Jay poem, The Brother of the Universe. But world is really the term that she uses much more frequently. But the idea that she understood and felt some sense of a kinship with refugees, to me, that speaks volumes about her sense of detachment from probably the religious, sphere, the way in which she was brought up, but the idea that she can find others through this kind of a society of books and reading. This is perfect, actually. I really appreciate the connection, which I did not remember. So thank you. Martha Nell.
Let's see, I've already talked, so I won't say too much, but remind us again, you don't have to do it right now, before this session closes. You looked up the word possibility, right?
Mm.
And it was very powerful. And so I hope you'll do that as we close the session.
Okay.
I want to thank Anne for mentioning Virginia Woolf. I keep thinking about her, and I did this yesterday, but I just put the name of a documentary produced by a Myth Fellow. That's the institute I started here at Maryland, that's gotten a lot of acclaim, and it's got like Vita's, son in it, who's a Stitch, talking about Vita and Virginia. Anyway, I think you might be interested in that, Anne. But in that, it also emphasizes connectedness. And this is about someone who was on Hitler's hit list.
Wow.
So let's see. Well, and also, I hope everybody's seen the recent TikTok on Dickinson, on teaching Dickinson.
That
Hello?
would be a very good thing to bring up tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow when there is the pedagogy session.
Yeah.
That Cheryl and Wendy are running. No, I did not see that, but the impossibility reference appears in the world. Actually the idea that all the world, or everything in possibility, is one of the definitions of worlding or world for Dickinson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Thank you. Li Shin?
Yeah, this is really a follow-up question. First of all, I really enjoy this a beautiful talk and such a productive conversation. I also enjoy Dan's opening. I feel like the perfect combination there.
Thank you.
And I guess I want to segue from what Martha Nail mentioned, what possibility to the word you use at the very beginning of world as a verb. I thought that's such a beautiful and very helpful way to begin it. And you mentioned that in the dictionary, the word world has been used as a verb there. I thought that was so fascinating because I don't remember reading Dickinson using the word as a verb, but it seems that there has been a usage of that during her period of time. Although I think in one of her letters to Abia Root, she did mention something about how she likes the world, enjoy the world so much that she couldn't possibly be like too religious. I feel like those I feel like that one of the definitions you show on the screen about world in being like referring to the ability of enjoying the world or being into the world.
Right.
Relevant there. Yeah, so I guess this is just a quick question about whether you remember like Dickinson or people around her time using the word as a verb at all.
So that's a great question. Thank you, Lishan. I mean, to the first one about the world as a verb, I don't actually. Really, this was the idea that I wanted to. Worldling is actually someone who is kind of part of the earth, so like an earthling, somebody who is involved in that. Dickinson does not use world as a verb, as far as I could tell. Worlding is an idea of how she is creating. I wanted to suggest the way she's creating worlds. She's continually transitioning, continually thinking about creating an identity, and and that's formed by her relationship with the world. It's also Heidegger, I found later, who coined the term, and I need to go back to that. What I did find that was fascinating was that another word, globe, which we think of as a noun, is actually used as a verb. Right? So it's to globe means to gather into a round, to bring together, right? To join. So, I mean, I could imagine this happening in Shakespeare and maybe in Dickinson, the idea that we're not just talking about a thing in the world, but we're talking about an action in which people are brought into people and the non-human, and things in the world are brought into relation with the self. And that is, I think, something that we see. Also, the letters, I think this would be the next step I want to take, which is to start to look at the letters. And thank you for the one to a buyer route. I think that sounds like a perfect one to begin with. But that's a place where I'm sure, and I do know because Martha Nell has mentioned it to me at least once, there are references that Dickinson makes to the world that would really help me with this, contributing to the theme. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Those comments have been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Speaking of seams, I like the idea of moving seamlessly from one session to another, but I think we don't want to. We want to give people a chance to get a little cup of coffee or whatever they might need at this time of the day. And there will be other times when we can continue the conversation. I'm sure a lot of people
need to head to Starbucks, I know.
Well, I'm not going to have time right now, but I also want to get this recording off to Don Skoog and see if we can get that process working. So the next session, Emily Dickinson and Taylor Swift, Aesthetic Resonances and Creative Encounters, will begin at 9:30. But we're all going to stay right here.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This is
wonderful.
Great.
So much fun. So many ideas. Dan, could you also